I want to reflect now on 1525. 1525 is a momentous year in Luther's career, both positively and negatively. First thing to note about 1525 is the Peasants War. There'd been Europe for some decades had been undergoing significant economic changes. The rise of commerce, the rise of cities. We tend to think of urbanization as a modern thing, but the rise of cities really, it's starting in the late medieval period, and it has a dramatic impact, of course. When you think about the disruption that urbanization would have brought to settled ways of life. My wife is from the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. It's a very rural community. When we go back to visit relatives, she has an elaborate extended family of cousins and second cousins who are all significant. I come from a much more, we might say, modernized England, where, yeah, I knew my cousins, but that was about the limit of it. And the family ties were not particularly strong or important. When Europe moves from the countryside towards the cities, it really does transform how people think about things. When you think about, if you'd grown up in rural Germany in the 14th, 15th centuries, as a peasant, as most of us would have been if we'd been around in those days, by and large, life was fairly stable. That you'd have known from fairly early on what you were going to do. You were going to be a peasant farmer like your dad. You'd have learned your skills that needed for life from your parents or your grandparents. You'd probably have met the girl you were going to marry by the time you were 3 or 4. You wouldn't have known you were going to marry her, but the world was fairly small. When you move to cities, all of that changes. Family ties become attenuated. Even skills change. Think about the rise of the printing press, how that changes the nature of life in that you become dependent upon somebody perhaps who's not a member of your family for learning your life skill, how that would change how you think about the world. You think about the pastoral changes that would take place when in a rural community where people have an elaborate family network to offer support to individuals, you don't find that in the comparative anonymity of the city. And that raises interesting challenges. It's interesting how pastoral care changes for Catholics even as the Reformation develops in the 16th, 17th centuries. And not simply as a reaction to Protestantism, but because the nature of life itself is changing. The rising successful Catholic order of the 16th century are the Jesuits. And the Jesuits have a form of piety that is built on a much more individual basis than you find in the Middle Ages. Dominicans and Franciscans lived in communities. Jesuits are able to move fast and rapidly. And Martin Scorsese's new film, Silence, that's just come out. I'm hoping to see it next Friday with my son. The book is a tremendous book, but it's a story of Jesuit missionaries in Japan. You can move Jesuit missionaries to Japan because you don't need a community. You can send just one because their piety is developed to be individual. Remember being at an accreditation meeting for the seminary with a load of deans from other theological seminaries, and at dinner I was sitting with a friend from a Lutheran seminary, and we were joined by Father Gabriel, who was the dean of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington at the time, and we were just talking about administrative things, and my friend David, the Lutheran, said to Father Gabriel, I think my friend so-and-so once stayed at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington. And Father Gabriel said, who's your friend? He said, he's a Jesuit. And Father said, no, never have a Jesuit stay. Very, very different form of spirituality and piety. And it's a reminder, yes, the Dominicans really rooted in the Middle Ages. Changes in Europe in the 16th century change everything for everybody. Populations become more mobile. Pastoral care becomes more mobile. Piety becomes more individually oriented. The rise of books of cases of conscience occurs in the 16th and 17th century. These books that contain ethical questions that you can then find an answer to. Richard Baxter's Christian Directory is perhaps the most famous example of a Protestant book of cases of conscience. The genre was really developed by the Jesuits and then taken over by the Protestants. There's a rather egregious example. I think it's Edward Bunny, who basically plagiarizes a Jesuit book of cases of conscience, gets rid of the bits about the Pope and the Mass, and essentially reprints it as a Protestant book dealing with cases of conscience. Piety is changing. The world is changing. And economic pressures are coming to bear as well. As people move from the countryside to the city, as the countryside is depopulated, that creates economic pressures for the countryside. I remember once saying to students, what happens when you're the feudal lord and suddenly you've got 30% less peasants on your land producing food for you? What do? And these very naive but altruistic students said, well, you reduce your demands on them by 30%. And I said, no, you make them all work a whole lot harder. You squeeze them that much more. I don't want to suffer just because the peasants are moving to the city. Peasants have got to work that much harder to keep me in the manner to which I've become accustomed. So there is a certain pressure coming to bear on rural populations with the rise of cities. Anti-Clericalism rises in the Middle Ages. Again, I think there are economic reasons for this. As rural wealth declines, more resentment kicks in relative to church taxes. The poorer people are, the more they resent paying their taxes. And also we can then throw into the mix Luther's theology. Luther's theology chimes with this anti-clericalism, particularly the early theology of sort of the early 1520s. Now remember, Luther thinks the world's going to end soon. So there is this bracing democratic rhetoric that we find in Luther relative to the church at this point. The priesthood of all believers is a big idea for him. Captures the imagination. That falls into very fertile soil. When you have a population that's beginning to resent the church anyway, and you have somebody coming along and giving ideological expression to that in a way that dramatically presents this new vision of the church and of Christianity in sort of more democratized terms, that seizes the imagination, becomes something of a rallying cry. We know that for several decades before Luther, the issues of justice and equity have been something that the lay people have been very interested in. I mentioned yesterday the Diet of Worms sort of peters out because some bright spark starts to put up bundschuh posters in the town. This radical peasant group that really flourished until from the 1490s to the mid-1520s. And the bundschuh appealed to godly law as a basis for establishing justice. It's very interesting at the moment. We have the social justice warriors on campus at the moment, and a lot of Christians are sort of picking up on that rhetoric. It's amazing to me how many conservatives I've seen citing Black Lives Matter positively. Obviously, every Christian should be opposed to racism. I think that's absolutely basic. But you go to the Black Lives Matter website, it stands for a whole lot more than just anti-racism. There's a whole heap of stuff there. But the rhetoric captures the Christian imagination because it chimes with so many things that Christians should be in favor of. And Luther's theology, I think, strikes a chord with these radical groups because when they hear the freedom of the Christian, they're not hearing the freedom refracted through the cross. They're hearing somebody talking about freedom from the undoubted oppression, unjust oppression that they're experiencing in the drudgery of their everyday lives. So Luther's theology emerges at a time when it can mesh with the thinking of the common people. And let's not forget, this is very much to Luther's advantage. When Aleander says, 9/10 of the people are shouting Luther and the other 10th are shouting down with the Pope, Luther draws tremendously on popular support. The problem, of course, is that a lot of his popular support actually doesn't understand what Luther represents. Luther is in many ways a socially very conservative thinker. Very conservative thinker. I mentioned yesterday the implications of his idea that you can do anything legitimate to the glory of God becomes, in Luther's mind, the idea of calling. And the idea of calling then connects to an idea of, well, God has placed you in the calling that He's given you. And therefore, you should accept it. If you're a street sweeper, you should not aspire to be the manager of street sweepers. God has placed you there. Do it to the glory of God. Do it to the glory of God. Your employer is abusive of you. Well, suffer it as a Christian. That's the implication of Luther's thinking when you tease it out. But that's not what the peasants think he's saying. So there is this radicalism that is being fueled by Luther's own thinking. And we even find it in some of the Wittenberg hierarchy. We talked yesterday about Karlstadt and Zwilling. Karlstadt and Zwilling have a more socially radical view of what the Reformation is, ironically drawing it from Erasmus. I mentioned, Erasmus and humanism. We tend to think of Erasmus as the guy who ultimately sided with the church. But actually, Erasmus's view of Reformation was in some ways more radical than Luther's, because he wanted to see a fundamental transformation of society through the recovery of classical learning. His ambition was greater than Luther's. Luther ultimately wanted the church to be the church. Erasmus wanted to see society transformed. So Karlstadt and Zwilling, drawing on Erasmian roots, are actually socially and politically more radical than Luther is. And, I mentioned Karlstadt takes to wearing the garb of a peasant when he walks around Wittenberg. I read Rusty Reno's book on resurrecting the idea of a Christian society. And he has a polemic there against people who don't wear ties. And it's not the usual kind of polemic, but it's a sort of not wearing a tie to a smart event or wearing sneakers with a suit. He says that's an elite thing. You can only do that when you can afford to do it. And it's a pose. He said, ordinary people have to go smart to job interviews because they can't afford not to get the job. And Rusty concludes it by saying, do something rebellious, wear a tie. I thought it was a pretty nice piece. Well, Karlstadt's like that. Karlstadt's part of the intellectual elite, and he's posing as a peasant. He's walking around in a peasant garb. There's something sort of personally rather pathetic about it, but it's also very clearly a political statement. And in 1524, 1525, it all explodes. It all explodes in the empire. A series of dramatic peasant uprisings take place. It's been, the Peasants War has been a perennial point of interest for historians. One of the things I used to get students at Westminster to read, Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's close friend and the man who, basically subsidized Marx's writings by giving Marx money. Engels writes an influential history of the Peasants' War, because the Reformation interested Marx and Engels because it was so clearly a kind of a revolution with social implications. And for Engels, of course, the Peasants' War represents the true but premature revolution of the oppressed lower classes that is crushed by the middle classes. Subsequent historiography has demonstrated it's far more complicated than that. But it's to say that the Peasants' War came to play in the 20th century a significant political role because it was part of the historical justification of Marxist theory. Explodes, the peasants are crushed at the Battle of Frankenhausen in 1525, when an imperial army drawn from both Catholic and Lutheran territories crushes the peasants. There's nothing like peasants and Anabaptists to bring out the ecumenical best or worst in the Catholics and the Lutherans. The Battle of Frankenhausen wipes the peasants effectively off the face of the earth. It's significant for Luther for two reasons. First of all, one of the men involved in the Peasants' Rebellion is a man called Thomas Müntzer. We mentioned Müntzer before. Müntzer was present at the Leipzig debate and was immensely impressed by Luther, and is initially a fan of Luther, becomes a good friend of Karlstadt. In 1520, he is pastor in the town of Zwickau, temporary pastor there, standing in during a vacancy, the town of Zwickau. Zwickau was an area of remarkable social unrest in the early 16th centuries. The Weavers' Guild, basket weaving today, we generally regard it as, I suppose, a rather effete activity. Basket weavers, very dangerous people in the 16th century. 1516, the Basket Weavers' Guild had beaten up the local Franciscans. They were the basket was like the biker gangs of the early 16th centuries. And they beat up the Franciscans. And when you think about it, there's a certain economic logic here. What are the basket weavers? What does the Basket Weavers' Guild represent? It represents the new emerging production economy. What do the Franciscans represent? They're a mendicant order. They're beggars. As you move into the early modern period, and as production starts to become important, beggars start to look like parasites and therefore become politically and socially vulnerable and look like representatives of that which is holding the age back. It's very interesting, just an aside, that witch trials are not really a medieval phenomenon. Hey, Phil, good to see you. Witch trials are not really a medieval phenomenon. They're really an early modern phenomenon. Why would that be? Think historically. Why would witch trials be an early modern phenomenon? Most people who suffer during witch trials are what? Women, but what kind of women? Widows, women beyond the age of childbearing. Think about it. In a productive economy, in a world where production is becoming a key virtue, those who cannot produce and cannot contribute become vulnerable. Now, I'm not saying that just because the economy is moving towards production, therefore they go out and burn old women as witches. What I am saying is they become vulnerable. They become vulnerable in that sort of situation. You can see it in our own world today. Certain people are more vulnerable now because they're not seen as conforming with what modern society would see as virtues. I was very challenged when we interviewed on the podcast, my podcast, we interviewed Wes Smith, the lawyer and writer on euthanasia issues. And at the end of the interview, sort of asked him, what sort of pastoral advice would you give to people like us when we're dealing with those who are, in comas and things like this? And he said, never talk about a vegetative state, never call these people vegetables. And I don't think that's good pastoral advice, but then it got me thinking, what kind of a world is it in which we would do that anyway? It's when we think of that person as of no more importance than a vegetable. And there's a whole world of cultural thinking that lies behind making that kind of language the knee-jerk instinctive response without really thinking about what we're saying. We're definitely seeing a shift in the early 16th century, a way in which begging and the ways of life built upon mendicancy are becoming to be seen as parasitic. So 1516, the Franciscans get themselves beaten up by the Weavers' Guild. It's not incidental that it's a begging order that's being attacked by the weavers. So Münster is pastor in Zwickau. Zwickau is an area of high social radicalism. And we know that during his time there, he spends a lot of time denouncing the Franciscans for their exploitation of the poor. These men are begging, they're not contributing to society, they're taking money away, and therefore they're responsible for the creation of poverty. And Münzer also meets there the Zwickau prophets, led by, we met them in Wittenberg, but they're led by a man called Nicholas Storch. The Zwickau prophets. And the Zwickau prophets, of course, are those who are led directly by the Spirit. So Münzer, having first been a fan of Luther, 1519, is now coming under the sway of much more radical elements. And he moves on from Zwickau to Prague. And there he starts to develop a theology of the Word, whereby he sees the Word of God not as Jesus Christ, not as Scripture, but the Word of God as something living and direct. Develops a mystical theology. Now, often I think when we use the word mysticism today, it's rather, we sort of read it through a post-1960s framework. You know, mysticism is George Harrison trying to yogic fly or sitting around saying the word Om over and over again. Mysticism has a rather sort of passive, meditative feel to it. Not mysticism in the 16th century. Münzer's mysticism is direct leading of the Spirit that, of course, becomes social revolution for him, because the Spirit leads him into socially revolutionary activities. He moves on from Prague in the early 1520s and becomes a minister in electoral Saxony, Luther's territory, in the parish of Allstedt. Here he becomes the first. He writes the first thoroughgoing vernacular liturgy of the Reformation. So Münzer, although he's going in a dramatic and crazy in some ways direction, one of his real claims to sort of positive fame is he understands the need for a vernacular liturgy. And he produces the first thoroughgoing vernacular liturgy of the Reformation. But his mysticism and his desire to see radical transformation of the world is getting the better of him. He preaches a sermon before Duke John of Saxony on Daniel 2, in which he demands that the princes instigate a program of radical social reform. Radical social reform. And also, he refers to Luther as brother fatted pig. The honeymoon period is definitely over. Luther is now becoming the enemy. I think one of the things that, give Münzer credit. Münzer realizes that Luther's language of freedom is not what many of those who follow Luther think it is. I think Münzer puts his finger on Luther's essential social conservatism. I'm not talking in modern terms, but I'm talking in sort of 16th century terms. That he puts his finger on realizing that Luther really doesn't want to shatter the social structure of the early 16th century in a way that many of his popular supporters, hearing this language of freedom, assume that he does. As a result of this sermon, Münzer is summoned to face trial at Weimar, but flees. And Luther is now convinced that his one-time disciple, albeit a sort of a fairly peripheral disciple, is now an extremely dangerous figure and is calling for radical social revolution. And he writes in 1524 a short text, Letter to the Princes of Saxony, concerning the rebellious spirit, in which he calls on the princes to be ready to intervene at the first sign of violence. He can see that the This is heading in a very, very dangerous direction. Munzer responds with a wonderfully titled book. One of the things to remember, of course, about 16th century books is there are no jacket blurbs. That you don't turn to the back of the book and there is 200 words telling you what the book's about. You tended to do that in the title. So the title is a summary of the book. And Munzer's title is this: A Highly Provoked Vindication and a Refutation of the Unspiritual, Soft Living Flesh in Wittenberg, whose robbery and distortion of Scripture has so grievously polluted our wretched Christian church. That's the title of the book. Not a big fan of Luther at this point, so I think we can safely assume. When the Peasants' Rising explodes then in 1524, 1525, Munzer is convinced this is a sign of the end of the times. Now remember, Luther too is living with the expectation at this point that the world is about to end. But he doesn't see it as coming in through violent social political revolution like this. Munzer joins the peasant army, and on the 12th of May, he is part of an army of 7,000 that engage the forces of the empire at Frankenhausen. And it's an absolute slaughter. There are certain events that go down in history as battles, but they're not actually battles. They're just sort of localized, systematic extermination of an enemy. Frankenhausen is a bit like that. A bunch of peasants who think that they're heralding in the end of time and therefore cannot be defeated, finding that when you meet a better trained and better equipped army, there is usually only one outcome. Battle of Culloden, the last battle fought on British soil, is a similar example. It's of 1745, the clans make their last stand against the Duke of Cumberland. It's not really a battle at all. They huddled together in a field, and the Duke of Cumberland pounded his cannons at them for 45 minutes until they were basically all dead. Not a battle. Frankenhausen, not really a battle. Munzer flees the field and is found hiding in a barn. Again, I'm thinking of when Auschwitz is liberated, of course, Josef Hörs, the commandant of Auschwitz, is found hiding in a barn nearby. And the British troops, the troops who capture him, give him a very sound beating before they arrest him, I believe. Munzer is captured and is tortured to death with red-hot pokers. Execution was not never a nice thing, but it was also a dramatic performance in the 16th century. The Peasants' War is of huge significance to Luther and his theology. General priesthood of all believers isn't really mentioned much by the Reformers after 1525. Because it's not that the concept is considered bad, it's that the language is considered very unhelpful. And Luther, after 1525, I think 1525 is the moment he begins to realize Jesus isn't coming back anytime soon, and we need to plan for the long term at this point. Luther, after 1525, is much more concerned about what's going on the ground and building structures for the future. Initially, Luther calls, the Peasants' Uprising starts, he calls for mutual agreement. I think Luther knows that the peasants have many legitimate social and political grievances. He knows that their lot is hard, that they are suffering. But when the violence breaks out, I think he has no choice but to side with the authorities. It's almost 1522 all over again. The emperor's following a policy of containment. If we can contain the trouble of the Reformation, then that's good enough for the time being. The electors do not want social and political revolution. They're happy. Many of them are happy for the church to have its wings clipped. Many of them are happy for tax money not to go to Rome. Many of them are happy for legal appeals not to be able to be made to Rome. But they don't want to be overthrown themselves, nor do they want to be seen by the emperor to be unable to control the trouble within their own territories, because at that point it will tip the emperor towards civil war, thinking that it's civil war. If that's the price we have to pay for social stability, that's the price we have to pay. So Luther swings strong behind the authorities in 1525, and he writes one of the two treatises for which he's most notorious, the other one being his book against the Jews of 1543, against the murdering hordes of peasants, which is, it's badly timed. It comes out towards the end of the crisis, and therefore looks a lot harsher than it might otherwise have had to be. And as I said before, one of the things that makes, two things that make Luther very successful. One, he's very stubborn at times, and he doesn't listen to advice, and that's a good thing when the advice you're being given is bad. And he also has a very, very powerful pen. Luther is able to write in a very pungent and effective manner, which is great when you're taking down the right people, and can be absolutely terrible when you're going after the wrong targets. And as I said earlier in the class, I don't think you can have the one without the other. If you've got the Luther who can stand at the Diet of Worms, or who can face down his opponents in Wittenberg in February 1522, the risk you run is that you have a Luther who writes something terrible against the Jews, or writes something terrible against the peasants. And that's what he does in 1525. And the work contains some quite astounding statements that, obviously he didn't mean literally, but he'll say things like, strange times when one can get to heaven more quickly by slaying a peasant than believing in the Lord Jesus. Now, we set that in the context of Luther's thinking as a whole. It's clearly a rhetorical thing to grab the attention, but it's rather tasteless. The best one could say is it's a rather tasteless kind of statement. Luther essentially advocates the violent crushing of the peasants in this 1525 work. And it goes down in history as the harsh book against the peasants. And even his allies, even many of his allies, thought that he'd gone too far. The gentle Melanchthon did not like this work. He thought that Luther had really gone beyond the pale, gone beyond the bounds of acceptability in what he'd written about the peasants. So this will be one of two major works that will stand as something of a real black mark against Luther's name. Looking back, I think one would say that strategically he makes the right choice. Siding with the authorities over against the peasants is the right choice in terms of preserving the Reformation. But he didn't have to do it with quite the violent rhetoric and relish that he did. The other PR disaster of the Peasants' Rebellion was Luther's marriage. Luther gets married at the height of the Peasants' War, and that is seen as a remarkably insensitive thing. By the way, Luther the movie, the Joseph Fiennes movie, great movie, pretty historically accurate. If you're a real pedant, you'll question the fact that there were pews in the church. Men would have stood, the women would have taken stools to sit on. But if you're not a real pedant, then you won't necessarily will find that problematic. More, I wouldn't say problematic, but where the movie takes real dramatic license is that it conflates the riots of 1522 that we talked about yesterday with the Peasants' Rebellion. Two separate events, but in the movie they're brought together, I guess for the sake of keeping the plot relatively straightforward and moving the drama forward. The Peasants' Rebellion and the riots of 1522 are two separate things. And in some ways, the riots of 1522 will ultimately represent one of Luther's great triumphs, because he's able to reassert his authority over Wittenberg Reformation at that point. The Peasants' Rebellion of 1525 is a disaster. And in conflating those two events, the director also misses the public relations disaster of Luther's wedding at the height of the Peasants' Rebellion, which was seen to be a remarkably callous thing to do. The equivalent of you can think of it, but if Winston Churchill had, gone off to paint pictures after after the Norway debate or something in the House of Commons would have been seen as a callous move. It's a similar thing for Luther in 1525. The marriage is worth mentioning, though, of course. His wife was an interesting lady. She had fled from the town of Nimschen along with a number of other nuns sometime previously, hidden in fish barrels. Mentioned before, personal hygiene in the 16th century, not great. One can only imagine that hiding in fish barrels would not have enhanced it any. The nuns arrive in Wittenberg. One of the issues, of course, is as monasticism collapses, it does put a lot of unmarried people out onto the street. In the early church, as female monasticism rises as a function of male monasticism, in a patriarchal society, when the man goes to a monastery, what do the women dependent upon him do? Well, they go off to monasteries too. So as when monasticism collapses in the 16th century, it creates social issues. And the obvious solution, of course, in Wittenberg is to marry the nuns off to the monks. As monasticism, as the Augustinian cloister is closed down, you get a bunch of single guys thrown onto the market. The obvious answer is to marry them off to the nuns that are also coming onto the market at that particular point in time. Katharina von Bora, who was given to a nunnery as a very small child, Katharina von Bora is the one who's left after they've matched up all of the nuns with partners. Quite some significant efforts are made to marry her off. She falls in love with one particular lad whose parents are not happy about him marrying an ex-nun. And so he's whisked away and that romance goes nowhere. Then the authorities in Wittenberg try to marry her off to some skinflint old Lutheran pastor in the territory. And she won't stand for that. So finally, Luther himself marries her. It's not a marriage born particularly out of love, though I think it's fair to say they do grow to love each other. And she's brokenhearted when Luther dies out on business in 1546. She's brokenhearted that she is not able to be with him. They have a number of children. Two of them die fairly young, including most tragically Magdalena. I think she was 13 when she dies. And Luther's description of her death and burial, even hundreds of years on, are real chokers in terms of reading the emotion. There's this rather touching bit where she's obviously dying, and she talks about how she's telling her father he should be happy for her because she is going to heaven, and he turns away because he's trying to show her that he doesn't want her to see that he's actually weeping with sorrow at that point. So a very moving account of the death. Always like telling this story. It's a slightly distasteful one, but it does make sort of sense and tells you something about the 16th century. One friend of mine in the Southern Baptist Convention, whose wife heard me tell this story, told me afterwards she could never read Luther again. She'd lost all credibility for it at this point. The marriage, the consummation of the marriage is witnessed. It's witnessed by a man called Johannes Bugenhagen. Bugenhagen writes in a note that he found the experience of witnessing the consummation of the marriage a most distressing experience. One can only imagine that the ex-nun, the now Mrs. Luther, would have found it far more distressing than he did. Question, why was the marriage witnessed? Well, one comment to make is that actually the witnessing of the consummation of marriages was not an uncommon thing in pre-modern societies. In peasant societies, often marriages would be consecrated sort of in the road in front of everybody. It's a sort of grotesque idea to us now, but in part that comes because of the way that notions of privacy have been shaped for us. I mentioned earlier in the week, my mum lives out in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire in an old weaver's cottage. It's small, but there's a little extension on it now. But 150 years ago, this weaver's cottage would have been one room downstairs and one room upstairs. They would have eaten, played, and conducted business downstairs, and they'd all have slept in the same room upstairs. And weavers kept multiplying in the 19th century, believe it or not. So they were obviously multiplying in the same room that their children were sleeping. And, that's a kind of tasteless to us and distasteful. But it is a reminder that it has not always been the way. But there's a more serious reason why Luther could have had privacy. But there was an important reason why Luther's marriage had to be witnessed, the consummation had to be witnessed. What is it? That's in part. There was always the aspect of, signs of virginity that was important, but even more so. So a virtual history question. Virtual history is these, let's ask a question, what would have happened if? This didn't happen. What would have happened if? What would have happened to the Reformation if Luther's first child had been stillborn? Would have been seen as cursed. Remember, I've said again and again in this class, Luther's a man of the Middle Ages. His world is that of the Middle Ages. His world is that of fairies and goblins. If you've never walked through a wood late at night in the dark and been worried that the goblins will come out and take you away, then you don't live in Luther's world, because that's the world of Luther. That's how he thought. Think about Catholic propaganda. What's Catholic propaganda all about? Catholic propaganda is all about, and Protestant propaganda playing it back. I mean, we all played this game. But Catholic propaganda is one, it's all about sex, and it's all about Satan, the Reformation. It was important that the consummation of Luther's marriage was witnessed in order to make sure that everything was normal. Remember, going back, it's the same mentality of the thunderbolt. When Luther's narrowly missed by a thunderbolt, for him that's a judgment of God. It's not just due to an ionic imbalance in the upper atmosphere because of ice crystals crashing around. It's a direct judgment from God. The same with the consummation of the marriage. It was important that somebody was there in order to say it was all normal. Katie doesn't have cloven feet. The devil didn't appear in the window at some point. It's a reminder that Luther's world is very different to ours. And often I've been intrigued by that question. If Luther's first child had been stillborn, that would have been a setback to the Reformation. That would have been a propaganda coup for the opposition. A propaganda coup. And it's a reminder to us that as much as we can read about Luther's world and we can recognize parts of it, it's also a very alien world to us as well. These people did think very differently. The marriage was very, very happy, though it seems. There were tragedies, of course, the death of the two children. Perhaps the most tragic of Luther's children was Martin Luther Jr. Great theologian like Martin Luther probably shouldn't have named a child after himself. Martin Luther Jr. tried to be a theologian, ends up as a rather pathetic alcoholic, a rather pathetic figure in later life. Great tragedy. Again, virtual history question. I wonder what his life would have been like if he'd been called David Luther or Hans Luther. Would he perhaps have had a different life? Who knows? Luther and Katie, of course, another thing to remember, one of the things we forget is people have to eat. Being a reformer is not actually a particularly lucrative profession. You don't get money for being a reformer. Luther gets money for he's a pastor, and he's a university professor, and he has a growing household. Now, as a rather super wedding gift, the elector gives him the Augustinian cloister in Wittenberg. You can go to it today. The Luther house was the old Augustinian monastery. And he was given that as a wedding gift. I can't imagine, what would my life have been like if somebody given me a house as a wedding gift? Given that most of my salary has gone towards paying off mortgage over the years. What a different world it would be to be given a house as a wedding gift. But it's huge. And Luther, because he and Katie needed money, they rented rooms. And there were always students in the house renting rooms. And so Luther, one of the greatest and most fun works of Luther you can get your hands on is Table Talk, which are the collections of Luther's witty conversations and sayings that he engaged in over dinner with the students and the many guests who would come. So that was one way that he raised money. By the way, the Table Talk is itself a polemical text in the history of Lutheranism. It was put together after Luther died by the Gnesio-Lutherans, not by the Philippists, not by the followers of Philip Melanchthon, but by the Gnesio-Lutherans. And we know that because there are great chunks of the Table Talk in which Luther is mocking horoscopes. Melanchthon was a huge fan of horoscopes. He never travelled over water, Melanchthon, because he'd had his horoscope cast and was told that if ever he travelled over water, the ship would capsize and he would drown. So he never ever travelled over water. So in the post-Luther world, when Melanchthon's enemies wanted to make the point that Melanchthon is not the heir of Luther, they produce this book, Table Talk, and they stick in all these bits about him trashing horoscopes in order to make the point Luther never had any time for this passion of Melanchthon. Was Melanchthon superstitious? No. I mean, do remember that I think the notion of science has changed somewhat over the years, and without wanting to be radically postmodern, I think it was generally thought then that the stars had a profound impact on the shape of one's life. You know, Halley's Comet is seen as a portent when it occurs of things that are going to happen. So I don't think Melanchthon's superstitious, just think he's a bit of an idiot, really. On that front, one might say. If you visit the Luther house, there is outside the door, there is this wonderful stone door frame with two little stools built into it. That was a birthday gift that Katie gave to Luther one year because she had become convinced that they didn't spend enough time talking. So she bought this door frame with these two chairs so that at the end of each day, they could sit on either side of the door and talk to each other. And when it was raining, which if you grow up like I did in Northern Europe, it rains almost as much as it does in California. I mean, the last 4 days have been awesomely Northern European. In Northern Europe, it rains a lot of the time. So you can't always sit outside and talk to your wife. They had a similar arrangement in one of the alcove windows upstairs. And you can still see, you go up today and there it is, these little seats built, wooden seats built into the alcove so they could sit and talk to each other. They spent some time as gardeners. Luther and Katie worked as gardeners in Wittenberg, earning money cutting grass. Luther set himself up at one point as a carpenter. He was a terrible carpenter, and there were so many complaints that he abandoned that as a way of earning money. But all of this is a reminder that real life goes on. Real life goes on. Luther doesn't earn huge money by being a reformer. Luther earns money by doing things for which he gets paid, of which reforming the church is not one of them. So Luther also had a very ordinary life. Mentioned before, of course, his wife was also a remarkable home brewer. The only safe way to drink liquid, really, in the 16th century was either beer or wine. If you were one of the elites, then you had access to wine. If you were a more humble peasant stock, then beer was the way to go. And there are these awful tales about they'd draw the water. They'd send out a warning when they were drawing water from the river so that people weren't relieving themselves into the river upstream when they'd draw the water to brew and things like that. Really, life in the 16th century for germaphobes would have been pretty intolerable, I think, on the whole. And the marriage was generally a happy one. I think it also had theological significance for Luther. When Luther writes his catechism, his small catechism, 1528, he is the first man in the history of the church who writes a question and answer catechism who'd first been a parent. Think about that. He's the first man who ever wrote a question and answer catechism who had a child, been a parent. And when you read the catechism, my wife and I, for many years, she still does it, but I've stopped since I took on the pastorate at the church. My wife and I, for many years, we taught the 3-year-olds at our church. Well, she taught them, and I read the story and sort of assisted her. And we used to use the PCA OPC material for the 3-4-year-old class, and we abandoned it after about 6 months because it became patently obvious to it that it was written by people who'd never taught 3- and 4-year-olds. 3- and 4-year-olds think in a very distinctive way. They're not idiots, but they think in very concrete terms. You can't really teach 3- and 4-year-olds abstractions. You have to teach them in concrete terms. What's interesting to me when you read Luther's small catechism is how concrete it is. It's written by a man who knows what it's like to talk to a 2-year-old. And I think he's the first person in church history who does that. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why his catechism remains a beautiful example of catechetical literature. Writing a catechism just isn't that easy. And the more simple and straightforward the catechism looks, the more one can be sure that real hard work and thought has gone into it. Because it's easy to write a bad catechism. It's very hard to write a good one. And Luther's small catechism is wonderful, wonderful. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that he knew what it was like to talk to a child. And children feature a lot in Luther's writings, particularly his later writings. He's always talking about children and about how children are to be the aspirational model of what it is to be a Christian. Start of his, in the preface of the Catechism, he talks about, those who think that they've got beyond the Catechism. The one thing you can say about them is they haven't even begun to learn the Catechism at that point. Because the whole point of the Catechism is to make us childlike and dependent in our faith. And children, Luther clearly loved his own children. He loved having children around. And the language of children and childhood pervades his theology in a quite striking way.